Welcome and thank you for standing by. All participants are going to remain on a listen-only mode for the duration of today's webinar. Today's webinar is being recorded. If you have any objections, you may disconnect at this time. I would now like to turn the call over to your host from the U.S. Census Bureau, Erlene. Erlene, you may begin.
Thank you, Anthony. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us for the May Local Employment Dynamics, or LED webinar. Before we begin, a few housekeeping items. We will save all our questions to the end of the presentation. Please add your questions into the Q&A box in the lower right-hand corner, and we will read them out loud after the presentation. The chat has been disabled to our attendees at this time. On behalf of the U.S. Census Bureau and the LED Partnership, in collaboration with the Council for Community and Economic Research and the Labor Market Information Institute, it is my pleasure to welcome back Maggie Smith as she presents Has the Gender Gap Improved Since COVID-19? This study examines women's progress in the labor market utilizing the Longitudinal Employer Household Dynamics Quarterly Workforce Indicators, or QWI dataset. In this presentation, Smith looks at wage growth to see how women have fared compared to men, specifically in North Carolina. Maggie Smith is a research analyst in the North Carolina's Department of Commerce's Labor and Economic Analysis Division, or LEAD. She has over 15 years of experience in research and data analysis. Prior to LEAD, she was a research analyst for the Economic Development Coalition of Asheville-Buncombe County and a research assistant professor at UNC Chapel Hill. She earned a BA in psychology from Kent State University, as well as an MS in psychology and PhD in neuroscience from Binghamton University. Now I'd like to turn it over to Maggie.
All right. Thank you so much for that introduction, Erlene. It's a real pleasure to be here with you today to talk about some of our latest research regarding the gender wage gap in North Carolina using QWI data. So I'm just going to go ahead and jump right in. So first, I just want to take a moment to acknowledge all of the progress that women have made in a relatively short period of time in the U.S. So remember that, let's remember that prior to a little over 100 years ago, women were not even allowed to vote in this country. And that changed in 1920 when the 19th Amendment granted women's right to vote. Since then, women have been nominated or earned positions of national leadership, including a Supreme Court justice, to a nomination for president, to our first female vice president. And efforts for equal rights between genders have been enacted with the passing of the 1963 Equal Pay Act, the 1964 Equal Rights Amendment, as well as the 2009 Lilly Ledbetter Fair Pay Act. So women have made a lot of progress in the U.S., but as we'll see during this presentation, there's still a lot of work to be done. Women have also entered the labor force at a higher rate since 1948. So this has occurred for many reasons, including the economic boom post-World War II, as well as rising living costs that necessitate dual income households, and higher educational attainment for women, just to name a few reasons. And the gap between men and women's labor force participation has narrowed, as you can see in this chart. And as of 2024, there is about a 10% difference between men and women's labor force participation in the U.S. So this presentation is about the gender wage gap. So I thought I'd take a little bit of time to talk about exactly what that is. So simply, it is the difference in earnings between men and women. And it's typically calculated as the ratio of women's earnings to men's earnings. So for example, if men make $1,000 a month and women make $800 a month, you can calculate an earnings ratio by dividing women's earnings by men's earnings, which will give you 0.8 or 80% in this example. Or you can think of it as 80 cents, women earn 80 cents for every dollar earned by a man. And throughout this presentation, I'm going to show you the data in this ratio. So it will be women's earnings as a percentage of men. And of course, if women earned the same amount as men, that bar wouldn't be at the 80%, but it would be at the 100%. So the wage gap is looking at the difference between where that bar ends and that 100% line. Now, why is there a gender wage gap? And this is a complicated question to answer. There's been a lot of research on this topic. And the research suggests that it can be influenced by a variety of factors, including occupational segregation, which is where men and women are concentrated in different occupations or industries. So for example, women might be overrepresented in caregiving professions like nursing and teaching, while men might be overrepresented in industries like construction and engineering. Men and women can also be distributed differently within the same occupation or industry. So typically with men occupying higher status, higher paying positions, and women occupying lower status, lower paying positions. There could also be a difference in the hours worked between men and women. So women may work fewer hours than men. There could be differences in education and experience. Of course, there's can also be bias, both implicit and explicit, so meaning unconscious and conscious bias. And I linked an article here, that a research paper that looked at both implicit and explicit bias in managers compared to other occupations. So it's a pretty interesting read if you're interested in that. There's also some evidence for a motherhood wage penalty. And so despite some progress in this area, the childcare responsibilities tend to fall primarily on women. And during this time, mothers may choose to leave the workforce to care for children at home, which may lead to an experience gap between men and women. Or they may stay in the workforce but trade higher wages for more mother-friendly jobs that are easier to combine with parenting. Or there's the possibility that employers may discriminate against mothers by assuming lower work commitment or performance. So all of these factors may contribute to the gender wage gap that we see in the US. So what can be done? A lot of efforts to address the gender wage gap often focus on promoting equal pay for equal work, increasing pay transparency, policies that support gender diversity across different sectors. So that's to counter that occupational segregation that we see. So for example, there's been efforts to attract women to construction and engineering and other sectors that are predominantly, that are male dominated. It's also supporting policies that facilitate work-life balance to help counteract that motherhood wage penalty. So the question is, have these efforts worked, and where are we regarding the gender wage gap? So the purpose of this analysis is to answer the question, has the gender wage gap improved in North Carolina since 2019, hence the title of this presentation. And I'm also going to further examine the gender wage gap in North Carolina, looking between industries, across age, as well as looking at education level. And these are all questions that we can begin to answer using quarterly workforce indicators, or QWI data. And QWI pairs QCEW data, which is that state unemployment insurance administrative data, with demographic data from the Census Bureau. And so it's really a great resource where we can get more detailed worker information. So we can look at demographic information like sex, age, education, race, and ethnicity. So, Sorry about that. So for the purpose of this talk, I'm going to focus on sex, age, and education. Unfortunately, there isn't a table for sex and race, or I would have included that in this presentation as well. The other nice thing about QWI data is that it's available at a variety of levels of geography. So today I'm going to focus on the state data, but we could also look at more local levels of geography if we wanted to. There's a variety of ownership levels we could look at, so public versus private. Today I'm going to look at all ownership levels. And then, of course, different levels of NAICS codes. So today I'll focus on 2-digit and 3-digit. So getting back to that first question, has the gender wage gap improved in North Carolina? And the answer is yes, slightly. So here I am showing you women's earnings as a percentage of men's earnings. In 2019, women earned 64% of what men earned. And that increased slightly through the years, all the way to 2023, which is the latest year we have available for this data. And so it increased from 64% to 68% in 2023. But of course, with women earning only 68 cents for every dollar men earn, there's still a lot of work to be done to understand why and to continue to make necessary corrections towards the goal of equal pay between genders. I also examined how North Carolina compares to other states in the southeastern part of the US. So in 2019, again, women earned 64% of what men earned in North Carolina, which is one of the higher wage gaps in the South at the time. Florida had the lowest wage gap at 67%, meaning that women in Florida were making more relative to men than women in North Carolina in 2019. However, by 2023, North Carolina surpassed Florida and now has one of the highest earning ratios at 68%, and this is a 4 percentage point increase. Other southern states made improvements in this area as well, so including Kentucky and all of our border states, South Carolina, Virginia, and Tennessee. So there has been progress on the gender wage gap in the South. Now we're going to take a little bit deeper dive into what's occurring with the gender wage gap, and we're going to start by doing an industry analysis. So just to give you a little bit of background information on North Carolina, I'm sure not everybody here is familiar with this data, but we have nearly 4.4 million jobs in North Carolina, and the graph is showing you the employment by industry for Q1 of 2023. And our top employment sectors are healthcare and social assistance, retail trade, manufacturing, accommodation and food service, as well as educational services. So this is going to become important when we talk about the women's share of employment, so I'll bring this back up later. In several of these graphs that I am going to share with you today, we're going to compare 2019 to 2023 so that we can take a closer look at the changes that occurred during that time period. So we know that overall the gender wage gap decreased by 4 percentage points during that time. So it went from 64% to 68%. And one question is whether this is due to changes in women's employment. So are women shifting employment to more higher paying industries? So here I'm starting off by showing you women's employment share by industry for 2019. And the total for all across all industries is 51%. So women have a slightly higher share of employment in North Carolina compared to men. So when we compare this to 2023, we see that the overall employment share is the same, so 51% again. And when we look at this high level analysis, we see that the biggest shifts in employment share for women are in administrative and support services, as well as transportation industries with a 3% increase. We're also seeing about a 2% increase in women in construction and wholesale trade. And retail trade has lost about 2% of women employment. So they went from 53% to 51% women employment. But all in all, I would say looking at this data, there are no major shifts in industry employment at this high level view. It's not like a bunch of women left accommodation and food services in droves for employment in professional, scientific, and technical services. Also, when we look at the industries with majority women employment, so those industries that are beyond the 50% line, they're outlined in this box. As you can see, healthcare leads the way with 80% women employment. And when you think back to the very first chart I showed you, women make up the majority of employment in 4 of the top 5 industries. So healthcare, education, accommodation and food, as well as retail in North Carolina. So this really underscores the point that women are integral to our economy here in North Carolina. Now we're going to switch gears and talk about the gender wage gap. So remember, the lower the number, the less money women are making compared to men. And the gender wage gap for all NAICS in 2019 was 64%. On this graph, I've also indicated the 100% line, which would mean that women earn the same amount of money as men. And as you can see, women earn less than men in all sectors, even in sectors in which there's a majority of women employment, which I've indicated by a blue star. Public administration has the lowest wage gap at 92%, whereas finance and insurance has the largest wage gap, in which women make only 48 cents for every dollar earned by men in that industry. So this chart is looking at the gender wage gap in 2019, and the question is, how has it changed by 2023? So again, looking at the total for all NAICS, there has been an improvement. So that's 64% up to 68%. And when we look at the sector level data, we see that most sectors have improved the gender wage gap, or at least stayed the same from 2019 to 2023. Shoot, I keep hitting the wheel on my mouse, so it's going backwards. So the green arrows indicate the sectors with the largest improvements for women's wages. So arts has an 8 percentage point increase. Professional, scientific, and technical services has a 6 percentage point increase. The other and wholesale trade has 7 percentage points, and manufacturing has improved by 5 percentage points. Only 3 sectors actually widen the wage gap slightly, with utilities, agriculture, and mining all about lowering that wage gap by about 2 to 3 percentage points. And these are really low employment sectors in North Carolina, but still worth noting. So all in all, this data is suggesting that there's an improvement in the gender wage gap, meaning we are getting closer to that 100% mark, although there's still a ways to go. And this is occurring in 14 of the 20 sectors in North Carolina. Now let's look at the actual wages for men and women in each sector. So these are Q1 2023 monthly earnings per sector, and the men are in the gray bar and the women's earnings are in the green bar. As you can see, finance at the top has the largest wage gap, again, between men and women. And to put a number on it, this is a difference of over $10,000 a month in pay. So men are earning more than $10,000 per month more than women in the finance and insurance industry. And this earnings ratio is at 48%, which is the lowest of all sectors. And as you can see, 3 of the 5 industry sectors with the largest pay gaps are also the highest paying industries. So finance, management, and healthcare. So next, I want to take a deeper dive on these industries, and I'm going to focus on finance, which has the largest gender pay gap in North Carolina, and it's also the highest paying sector, and healthcare, which is our largest employment sector in North Carolina and is made up of 80% women. So specifically, I want to start teasing apart why there are large pay gaps in these sectors and examining whether this is because of the occupational segregation. So are women employed in these lower paying occupations or lower paying industries within these large sectors? So to start answering these questions, we can use QWI data by looking at the 3-digit NAICS. And we could also look at 4-digit with QWI, but I wanted to simplify the analysis for the purpose of this presentation. So starting with finance, we see that the lowest earnings are in the insurance carriers and related activities industry, whereas the highest earnings are in securities, contracts, and investments. So the question is, are women predominantly employed in the lower paying industry in finance? And the answer is yes. So insurance carriers and related activities industry has the highest share of women employment at 64%. And securities, contract, and investments have one of the lowest shares of women employment at 43%. So this is some evidence for the occupational segregation theory. But what about the gender wage gap in these specific industries? Are women making more? Are women making significantly less money than men in these higher paying industries? So when we look at the gender wage gap, which is in the green numbers here, it's actually largest in the 2 highest paying finance industries, where women are making 39 cents and 49 cents for every dollar earned by a man. So of course, we all know that industries are made up of many occupations. So these differences in earnings could be due to, in part, to the specific occupations held by women within the industry. Unfortunately, it's really difficult to get this detailed occupational information at the state level. But I did do a little bit of digging at the national level using the American Community Survey from the census. And at the national level, women do make up the majority of bookkeepers, which is a lower paying occupation in the funds and trust industry. And they make up a large percentage of brokerage clerks, which is also a lower paying occupation in the securities, commodities, and investment industry. So again, there's some evidence there that women are in these lower paying occupations, but it's a little bit more complicated than that when you look at the data. So again, at the national level, there are actually more women in higher paying positions as well. Like there are more women accountants, there are more women financial managers, and further, in those occupations, men still make more money than women in these higher paying occupations. So occupational segregation is one factor, but it's certainly not the whole story. So in healthcare, there are also higher paying and lower paying industries. So the lower paying industry is social assistance. And of course, as you can see, the high paying industry is hospitals. So when we look at employment level, we see women's employment is slightly higher in the lower paying industry, but it's certainly not as pronounced as what we saw with finance. And again, healthcare is predominantly female sector, right? Over 80% employment overall. But we know that the wage gap is one of the largest of all the sectors. So what's going on here? So we're going to look at the gender wage gap in the green again. So when we look at the wage gap in healthcare industries, you see that the largest gaps are again in the higher paying industries. And this could be due in part to occupational segregation, where women tend to be nurses rather than doctors. Indeed, when we look at the ACS data at the national level, there are 60% more male physicians compared to females. So when you look at the wage, the earnings of physicians, though, we still see that male physicians make more money than women physicians. So, which could be related to other things like hours worked, specialization. There's just so many other factors that can go into it. And we'd have to do a deeper dive, I think, on the occupational data to really start to understand. But in both industries, we are seeing some evidence of this occupational segregation that's playing a role in the gender wage gap. So let's switch gears again to look at how the gender wage gap varies by education level. So first, I think it's fairly well known that the higher the educational attainment, in general, the higher the earning potential is for an individual, which is illustrated nicely in this chart. So stepping out of the industry analysis a bit, let's consider, again, the gender wage gap across all NAICS. So overall, we're at 68% in North Carolina. And so maybe it's that more men have bachelor's degrees than women. That's a plausible explanation. But when we look at the data, we see that, in fact, more women have bachelor's degrees than men, and also some college and associate's degrees. So women employed in North Carolina are outpacing men in terms of educational attainment. Although there is some improvement from 2019 across all education levels, so 2019 is in the gray bar and 2023 is in the blue bar, you can see that the wage gap widens with more education. So even though more women have bachelor's degrees than men, the wage gap is largest for those women. And I'm not sure why that is, but perhaps one contributing factor may be that it has something to do with choice of degree program, but we would have to investigate other data to really get at that answer. So going back to our industry story, again, finance and healthcare sectors have some of the largest wage gaps in North Carolina. Is it perhaps because of education level differences? And that may be the case for finance. So as you can see, for the finance industry, the bachelor's degree or the people employed with a bachelor's degree or advanced degree tend to mostly be male. So women are just at that 49% there in that industry. But that's not the case for healthcare, and it's certainly not the case overall. And we run into the same story with the higher the education, the larger the wage gap. And the wage gap is even more pronounced at these higher education levels in finance and healthcare industries when you compare it to the total NAICS chart on the left. So at these higher educational levels, women are making 50% of what men are making in the finance industry, and they're making 46% of what men are making in the healthcare industry when they have a bachelor's degree or advanced degree. And it's interesting that in healthcare, there is quite a large drop in women's earnings relative to men at the bachelor's degree level. And this may again point back to the fact that there are more male doctors than women doctors. But again, from this data alone, it's a little bit difficult to tease that apart. So now I'd like to quickly take a look at the gender wage gap across age, and then we'll wrap up. So the gender wage gap widens with age, starting at about age 25, and is particularly pronounced at age 35. So what I'm showing you here is the average monthly earnings between women and men. And you can see that starting at age 35, men's earnings actually surpass that average across all ages. And this could be indicative of the motherhood wage penalty that I talked about early on in the presentation. So around the time women start having children, the wage gap seems to increase and it never recovers, carrying over into the 65 plus age group. So here's the same data shown as the ratio of women's earnings to men, and we're comparing it to 2019 here as well. And so you can see there's been a slight improvement from 2019 across all age groups, except for that really early age group at 14 to 18. But again, the wage gap widens with age and is the largest in the oldest age groups. So the 55 to 64 group, women are earning 60% of what men earn. And at the 65 to 99, they're earning 63% of what men earn. So what about the gender wage gap across age in our industry story? So looking at finance and healthcare again. So the gender wage gap widens with age, and this holds true in the finance and healthcare industries as well. I wanted to share this data because I found it really interesting, and I haven't quite figured out the reason why yet, but I think it's interesting that in healthcare, women make more than men in the earlier age groups, and the same is true for the 19 to 21 age group in finance. But again, the gender wage gap widens with age, and this seems to happen a little earlier in finance when you compare it to the overall average. So we see in all NAICS that age gap is really pronounced starting at age 35, but in finance, it starts at age 22. And in healthcare, it's starting a little bit earlier as well at age 25 to 34. So I wish I had a little bit cleaner of a story to tell you, but again, this is a very complicated issue. And so let me just go over some of the findings that we found with this particular study. The first is that the gender wage gap in North Carolina has improved since 2019. And it doesn't appear to be driven by any one industry or education level or age group. We're seeing this across the board. However, in 2023, women still make less than men in all industries. Some of the highest paying industries have the largest pay gaps. And again, we looked at finance and healthcare in particular. And this is partly due to occupational segregation, but it's a complicated story and it warrants some further investigation. Women outpace men in educational attainment, But the wage gap is largest at these higher education levels. So it's not that women can educate themselves out of this wage gap. And the gap is most pronounced after age 35, and it never recovers. Again, lending some evidence to that motherhood wage penalty. But of course, there are still many questions left to be answered. So some examples to further explore the gender wage gap in North Carolina are to look at the impact of full versus part-time work. Looking at the occupational differences between men and women within an industry would be amazing. I just have to find a good data source for that. So if there's any suggestions, I'm happy to hear them out. We could also examine degree program choice between men and women. So, women are getting more bachelor's degrees, but what are they getting bachelor's degrees in? What programs? Maybe it's programs that are paying less. Also want to see the impact of children on women's wages, hours, and occupations. And of course, we would need a data set where we could compare women with and without children and men with and without children. So that would be really interesting to investigate further. And of course, we want to also investigate the influence of race on the gender wage gap, which we know that there is one. And so that's another area of great interest for us. So with that, I thank you so much for your time, and I hope that you found this information valuable. I've provided some links to our blog and data dashboards. If you're interested in what's going on in North Carolina, please do check those out. And with that, I am happy to take any questions or comments from the audience.
Thank you, Maggie. Before we go to your questions, the presentation will be accessible on Census Academy website at census.gov/academy under the webinar tab in a couple of weeks. The link has been added to the chat. Again, please type all of your questions in the Q&A and keep your questions pertaining to the presentation. The chat has been disabled to our attendees. Okay, Maggie, question number 1 comes from Mustafa. What is the measure of earnings?
So the measure of earnings, which may be better explained from the QWI people, but I believe that the measure of earnings is coming from that QCEW data in which employers are asked how much their employees are earning. So I don't know if anybody from the QWI team has any more information on how earnings are measured with QWI specifically.
We have a lot of economists that actually are the ones that answer that question.
Okay.
So unfortunately, I cannot, but if you'd like, you can always send a question to our feedback, and I will put that in the chat for that feedback, and they'll be able to answer that question for you.
Thank you. Our next question is from Rory Callahan. Have you or any of the census, excuse me, let me start over again. Have you or any of the other census and analysts on the panel found that the COVID shutdowns and school closure, remote learning, and child care centers closing due to pandemic impacted women being more impacted with the loss of employment than men? And did women have a harder time recovering, that is getting back to work, since the pandemic?
Yeah, that is a great question, and not something that I dove into specifically for this presentation. We have done some other research that indicates that, and I've read at the national level as well, that women were hit particularly hard during the pandemic with the loss of childcare and things like that. But according to our research, at least in North Carolina, women were able to rebound from that, and their employment has gotten back to those pre-pandemic levels. So that rebound did occur. Are there any other questions?
Yes. Okay. Next question is for Nicole Swepton. When you look at the gap at the national level using ACS data, what kind of differences did you find? Did the gap close when you held occupation constant and looked within occupation wages?
Right. So I didn't do a deep dive on this yet, but it's certainly on my agenda to look at. When I briefly looked at the data, the ACS data for this presentation, I was comparing the detailed occupations that were available at the national level. So I looked at things like accountants, financial managers, and I compared the wages between men and women in those groups, and I found in financial managers, accountants, and physicians, men made more than women in all of those occupations. Those groups still may be quite large, so it may not be granular enough really to get at some differences that may occur between men and women, but that was the best data that I could find at the time. Again, I'm certainly interested if anybody has any suggestions for data sources to start digging into this question a little bit more granular level, specifically at the state. I would be super excited to hear any advice on that.
We have a two-part question from Mustafa. The first question is, in addition to motherhood penalty, maybe there are factors such as experience and tenure. And the question goes on to say, what was the population of analysis? All workers or full-year workers?
All workers or what? What was that last part?
I'm sorry, full-year workers.
Okay, so like part-time versus full-time workers?
That was not said. Let me see if he typed that in elsewhere. Mustafa, if you can let us know the answer.
So certainly regarding the motherhood wage penalty, experience could play a part in that for sure. If a mother is dropping out of the workforce, there's several years there in which they're not gaining that experience in terms of employment. Now they gain other experience being a woman, and we could talk being a mother, and we could talk a lot about that as well. But yeah, so there could be an experience gap due to the motherhood penalty.
Okay.
Go ahead.
Okay, so Mustafa said full year equals working all 4 quarters.
Okay. So that's an interesting question. I used the QWI earn S, so it's stable employment throughout the quarter. I did not look at stability across all 4 quarters. But what I thought you were asking about was the full-time versus part-time work, which I think may play a role in this as well. And that's something that we want to follow up on to see how that is affecting the gender wage gap overall.
Thank you. Our next question is from Victoria Blackham. Was there any comparison to other states or national data to see if the same industries like finance or healthcare have the worst gaps?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I unfortunately didn't have time to do that, but it would be a great thing to follow up on because I am curious as well. I showed some of that state comparison data to the southeastern states, and we know overall some of them have improved. I'm curious if it's, if they're seeing the same things that we are in terms of industry differences in the wage gap. So haven't looked at that yet, but that's a great thing to follow up with.
Thank you. Another question from Mustafa. Was it mean or median, quarterly or monthly or annual?
So yes, the QWI earnings data is average. So we're looking at average and monthly wages.
Thank you. The next question is from Leslie. Is there similar research being done in NYS? If so, can you please send me a contact?
In NYS, I'm not sure what that stands for.
Leslie, if you can please type in the chat, the QA, excuse me, to let us know what NYS is. Then we can go back to that question once she does that, okay?
Sounds good.
Oh, she wrote New York State. New York State.
New York State.
Uh-huh.
Oh, that's a good question. Not that I'm aware of, but that doesn't mean that it's not occurring. So certainly you could look at it yourself if you wanted to, or I could look at it. That data is available with QWI. So, but I'm not aware of anybody doing that in particular.
Thank you. The next question is from Melanie Ng. What would be the measures potentially for further analysis on the impact of having children to women's wage, in parentheses, wage growth, to the extent that it could affect the birth rate?
Could you repeat that question?
Sure. What would be the measures potential excuse me, let me start over again. What would be the measures potential for future analysis on the impact of having children to women's wage, parentheses, wage growth, to the extent that it could affect the birth rate?
The extent that it could affect the birth rate. So yeah, I'm not quite sure how to answer that. I guess I'm not really sure what the question is, but when we look at women's wage growth, when we're looking at mothers in particular, we would want to compare women with children and women without. I'm not sure how that's relating to the birth rate, or if you want to expound upon that question, I would be happy to try to answer it, but I'm just not sure what you're asking at this point.
Okay. Next is from Polly. Related to the COVID imposed shutdowns and move towards more remote work opportunities, do you know of any other resources to look further into the benefits costs related to women in the work realm when they are more opportunities for full remote employment?
Yes, great question. I am not aware of data. It's really hard to get data surrounding remote work in general, let alone for women in particular. So I'm not aware of any resources. Again, if anybody does come across something, I would be really interested to learn about it myself, because I think that's a great question.
This is from Leslie Weatherly. To what extent is the senior financial services sector monitored to determine if there is fairness and equity in the hiring and employment practices? If nominal, could this explain hires, promotions, etc., based on who you know as opposed to what you know?
Yeah, that's a great question. I don't have any information, especially regarding the finance industry in general, but of course that is one of the issues that I think we need to address, and I'm not sure if there are great data sources out there for this either, to understand, is it because women are not being promoted into these senior leadership roles, or is there something else going on there? Yeah, I don't have that information on hand to know specifically.
Mustafa is following with a comment on his question versus working off
Yeah.
quarters. His comment is all workers is going to include all durations of work during the year. So just to let you know.
Okay.
Going next to Cody Hill. Is there an unadjusted gender gap? Excuse me, let me start again. Is there an unadjusted gender pay gap that takes into account strictly hourly wages, so it is not conditioned by the number of hours worked?
Yeah. Yeah, so if you look at some ACS data, you can look at hourly wages there, but that's not available with the QWI data. But there are different data sources that you can look to for that specifically. And I've done a little bit of work with that as well. But today's presentation, it was about assessing this gender pay gap using QWI.
Okay. I believe all of our questions have been answered. Probably just clarify that it was moved to more remote work opportunities, which you addressed earlier. So with that, we are down for our Q&A.
All right. Wow, that was a lot of questions. So I just saw something come in. One last question.
Okay, you got it? Okay.
Oh, just a thank you.
Thank you.
Roy is very thankful. So thank you, Roy. Anyway, that was a wonderful presentation, obviously, by all of the questions. So thank you everyone for joining us this afternoon. And thank you to Maggie for her really interesting presentation. Maggie, would you like to make any closing remarks?
Sure. I would just like to say thank you so much for this opportunity. It was so great to share some of this information with you all. We are still in the beginning stages, so I keep offering this, but if you have any other comments or thoughts on this type of research, or if you're doing something similar, I would love to hear from you and to just discuss what you're finding in your state as well. So please feel free to reach out to me. My email is on the slide here. And thank you again all for your attention and your wonderful questions that you asked. So thanks.
This concludes the May LED webinar. Please join us next month on Wednesday, June 12th at 1:30 p.m. Eastern Time, when Hubert Janicki presents how the COVID-19 pandemic prompted more people to change jobs. Upon exiting this webinar, you will receive a pop-up to an evaluation. We would appreciate that you take the time to answer the questions so we may better serve you with future webinars. On behalf of the U.S. Census Bureau and the LED Partnership, thank you for joining us. Until next time, enjoy the rest of your afternoon.
Session has ended. You may disconnect at this time.